Growing up in a rough neighborhood has a peculiar way of shaping your perception of the world. And for me, it all came down to the neighbors. In these areas, you'd find a fascinating mix of individuals: the ghost neighbors who stayed hidden, the neighbors from hell, and those incredible souls who, in the midst of chaos, became your lifeline. On the right of our house lived one such ghost neighbor who, with time, shed his enigmatic aura to become a friend. But it was the neighbor on our left who was something truly special: my godparents. Now, across the street, the scene was far less harmonious. A family deep in the throes of addiction, a couple of doors down a man who brewed and sold meth, and an intricate web of users and sellers, with the hub of activity residing at the corner houses of each intersection. The White Guy, or Tweaker Dan, as he was known, was a local legend. With a makeshift auto shop in his garage, he worked tirelessly on cars, greeted by a steady stream of folks coming to buy meth or just hang around. Sometimes, these interactions escalated into loud disputes, and occasionally, gunfights ensued. The mere presence of his firearm was usually enough to send people packing. Yet, Tweaker Dan wasn't the menacing figure I'd always perceived him to be. As I grew older, I learned more about his operations through mutual friends. You see, Dan didn't just serve the neighborhood's users and dealers. He controlled a significant portion of the local drug supply chain. Despite two powerful gangs vying for control of the area, our neighborhood remained a sort of neutral ground, thanks to Dan's influence. While either gang could have overrun us, they chose not to, all because of Dan. Dan was their supplier, and the gang members knew him as the White Guy. Their unspoken agreement was clear. They'd obtain their supply from him, but they would stay far away from his territory. This was the deal he had with anyone affiliated with him. He sold to many but had a single rule: don't bring trouble to his doorstep. The reason for his bike rides became clear in light of this knowledge. Dan wasn't just cycling around to stay healthy. He was patrolling his turf. Waving was his way of telling everyone that he was vigilant, and he was watching. As for those of us who weren't part of his network, we had no idea about these rules and agreements. We only saw his peculiar behavior, heard of his drug dealings, and witnessed his erratic schedule. The neighbors not involved in his business often regarded him with suspicion, but what was truly intriguing was the collection of houses that were friendly with him. For a man dealing with meth heads, he also counted prison guards, local families, and even my godfather as friends. They understood the unspoken wisdom of Tweaker Dan. They knew about his rules, the agreements that, paradoxically, kept our neighborhood from falling further into the abyss. That's the story of Tweaker Dan, the enigmatic, complex neighbor who, in the most unlikely way, became both a force of order and chaos in our turbulent neighborhood. I moved into a new apartment about 6 months ago, and my neighbor was a seemingly friendly lady with 3 young children. Our initial interactions were pleasant enough. We'd occasionally have a few drinks, and I thought she was a decent person. Little did I know how quickly this would turn into a nightmare. One day, she asked me for a favor: to watch her kids for an hour while she ran an errand, promising to pay me for my time. What I thought would be a brief babysitting session turned into a 4-hour ordeal. She returned home completely intoxicated and conveniently forgot to compensate me for my trouble. Frustrated but trying to be understanding, I let it slide. Soon, she began taking advantage of our budding friendship, repeatedly dropping her children off with me. Each time, she returned home inebriated. I'd grown tired of this irresponsible behavior and decided to avoid her by not answering my door. A couple of weeks later, I came home from class to find her throwing a wild party in our hallway. She spotted me and invited me in for a few drinks. I thought, why not? But the casual gathering soon spiraled into chaos. She started snorting pills and downing shots while holding her infant. As the night wore on, most of the partygoers passed out or left. The situation took a horrifying turn when she vomited on the floor, nearly dropped her baby, and then fell into a drunken stupor. Alarmed, I did my best to look after her kids. I fed them and made sure they were comfortable before I left. This unsettling pattern repeated several times. Eventually, she started leaving her young children home alone. These kids were 8, 5, and 3 months old. Frightened and hungry, they would knock on my door. I couldn't ignore them, so I'd feed them and let them hang out in my living room until their mother returned. I reached a breaking point when she left her kids alone for hours on end. This time, my roommate and I decided we couldn't let this continue. We called Child Protective Services and the police. When the officers arrived, they were furious. They discovered that she had left her children alone, and they had tried to cook, causing broken glass to litter the floor. The baby had been neglected so badly that her diaper was stuck to her skin, and there was evidence of physical abuse. I shared with the police all the incidents I'd witnessed over the past few months. They took our statements and waited for her to come home. When she finally arrived, she immediately turned aggressive with the police. They arrested her. One of the officers returned upstairs and informed me that she had tried to pin the blame on me, insisting that I was supposed to be watching her kids. She wanted me to lie for her. I staunchly refused. It turned out she had arrived home drunk and had previous charges for child neglect and theft. She had been in jail since December, while her children found refuge with their grandparents, receiving the love and care they deserved. But this woman's behavior was a nightmare, and I'm relieved to be rid of her. My parents' next-door neighbors have been a never-ending source of frustration, especially the wife. She seems to thrive on being a thorn in everyone's side. When their kids were in school, this lady developed the charming habit of sitting in the driveway at the ungodly hour of 6:30 a.m. and incessantly honking her car horn until her children finally materialized for their school run. The nerve. One day, my mom had the courage to ask if they could please refrain from this daily ritual. You'd think it was a reasonable request, right? Oh, but you'd be wrong. A resounding "oh hell no" was their answer. Not only did they persist with their honking, but they also decided to level up the annoyance factor. From that point on, everyone in their house joined the honking brigade, repeatedly and loudly sounding their horns every time they pulled out of the driveway, just to be spiteful. This obnoxious symphony continued for years. If that wasn't enough, they accused my mom of encroaching on their property with a garden. Mind you, my parents have lived there for a quarter of a century, and this garden has been there just as long. In a fit of fury, they enlisted the services of a land surveyor to delineate the exact edges of their property. Lo and behold, the garden encroached by approximately 4 inches. This discovery sent the lady into a borderline frenzy. She spray-painted a gigantic neon orange demarcation line between the yards, ripped out the garden, replaced it with a minuscule fence, and decided to store their trash bins on the contested property, right in the back corner of their yard. Of all places, which was incredibly inconvenient, if you ask me. Now, bear in mind that this neighborhood operates with a civic association, and any alteration to one's property, such as erecting a fence, requires the permission of a majority vote. Yet, these rules seem to elude her. The saga doesn't end there. She also accused my parents of depositing dog feces in their yard. Here's the kicker. My parents don't even own a dog. This family, on the other hand, possesses not 1, not 2, but 3 wiener dogs that are inexplicably confined indoors and never walked. A true tragedy for these poor canines. Enraged, the lady stormed over to my parents' house and unleashed a tirade of furious accusations. My dad bore the brunt of her wrath this time. He recounted her rant as being a nonsensical tirade, filled with paranoid delusions about my mom plotting against them and sabotaging their household. The entire situation is bizarre, to say the least. Some neighbors are simply a law unto themselves. It all began with our new neighbor, and the spark for this simmering feud ignited when he erected a fence that encroached far beyond the limits of his own property, effectively forcing pedestrians to amble along the road instead of using the sidewalk. My father, never one to back down from an encroachment on his rights, approached the neighbor with a polite request to correct the fence situation. But alas, this neighbor proved to be a character unmoved by common courtesy. His ears seemed to be impervious to my dad's words, and thus a battle for the ages was set in motion. In retaliation for our audacity in seeking the solution through official channels, the neighbor embarked on a campaign of retribution that lasted for an entire year. First, he adorned his house with multiple spotlights that, like malevolent stars, came to life at precisely 8 p.m. every evening, casting an unwelcome blaze of light that turned our bedrooms into a nocturnal carnival. Then he decided to treat us to his own melodious symphony. Right behind his house, he affixed a school bell, the very emblem of innocence, to the exterior. This school bell, however, was no ordinary bell. He had ingeniously connected it to his telephone line. Thus, whenever his phone rang, so did the bell, infuriatingly, loudly, and at all hours of the day and night. But the pinnacle of his passive-aggressive mastery came when he set his sights on the garage. This was no ordinary garage. Technically, it belonged to him, but it was also an extension of our house. When he learned of our intention to sell our home, he unleashed his inner artist. The garage, once a model of nondescript neutrality, now gleamed in neon pink, with daring neon green stripes that would give even the boldest racing car a run for its money. The results of this one-sided feud were astounding. This neighbor, who might have possessed an uncanny knack for the art of passive aggression, was somehow cunning enough to turn the tide in his favor. His grasp on the local real estate market seemed to have grown unassailable. To this day, he stands as the owner of 16 out of 20 properties on our old block, marking a puzzling yet impressive victory of wits and wills in a suburban battleground.